All right, let's begin. I was here twice before, once last year and then more recently last month. And the first time around, we talked about creation and the theory of creation according to Advaita Vedanta and also Dvaita Vedanta. And I proposed a creation equation that is up on the screen. X minus y is equal to x. When you have mathematical equations like that, it is easy to communicate what you want to say, because mathematics is a very precise language. It is a language without borders. The second time I was here, we talked about, this was last month, we talked about happiness and contribution to society equations. They are a little more complicated, but basically relatively straightforward. The topic today is Nirgun Brahman. And unfortunately, I do not have an equation for Brahman. So it might get a little bit complicated in terms of communicating what Nirgun Brahman is, but I'll stop along the way and try to summarize in several different places. Before I begin, though, let me thank Dr. Sane for this opportunity to talk to you, and to Arun Bhargav for arranging this session. Arun arranges, my friend Arun arranges all these sessions Sunday morning. Nothing can happen without him in these sessions. And yet, I have never seen him take any credit for anything that happens. And Brahman is something like that. Nothing in this world can happen without Brahman, and yet Brahman takes no credit for anything that happens. He doesn't take credit for anything good that happens, and he doesn't take blame for anything bad that happens either. So how can this be? Nothing can happen without him, and he is not responsible for anything. How can this be? I heard this analogy, and I've talked about it before. I heard this analogy many years ago in Pune, India, when I was listening to Swami Parthasarathi in that city. And what he said was that Brahman is like the gas in your car. Brahman is like the gas in your car. The gas brings car to life. Nothing can happen with the car unless there is gas in the car. Yet, if you drive the car into a ditch, the gas takes no responsibility for it. It could not have happened without him, without the gas, but it takes no responsibility for it. And similarly, if you happen to win Daytona 500, he takes no credit for that. The gas takes no credit for that either. So Brahman is like that. Now, turning to today's topic in a little more detail, the unfortunate situation is that Brahman has been said to be achintya, meaning cannot be understood by thinking alone, cannot be understood by thinking alone, and therefore is usually explained by negation. neti, 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 not this, not this, not this, meaning that Brahman is not like anything that we are familiar with. And that has a certain, that thinking pattern, that philosophy, there is a reason for that, but it never ends up telling you what Brahman actually is. Right? It tells you what Brahman is not, but not what Brahman actually is. So it can be very frustrating if you, as a thinking person, if you want to understand what we are talking about here in terms of Brahman. I mean, can you imagine, for example, suppose I have stomach ache and I go to my doctor, my internal medicine person, and I say to him, I have, doctor, I have stomach ache. Could it be because of something I ate yesterday? And the doctor says, neti. Well, could it not that? Well, could it be, you know, stomach cancer? Oh, neti, not that. If this thing persists, then chances are that I am likely to find another doctor. So the neti philosophy takes us only so far. So I want to take a little different approach today. I want to take an iti approach, painting a picture of Brahman in a way, a word picture of Brahman. And the sort of method that we are going to use is something that Euclid popularized and has been used many times since then, which is that if you remember your plane geometry from perhaps middle school, what Euclid does, that plane geometry is due to Euclid, and what he does is that he starts off with a series of assumptions. For example, one of the assumptions he makes is that a line, a straight line, has no width. Now, you could look at that assumption and say, well, you know, this assumption, what if it is true that the straight line has no width? Well, it doesn't even exist. So what's the point of pursuing this subject if it is based upon things that don't even exist? But we do not do that. We essentially accept those assumptions and continue, and then the entire plane geometry unfolds. We look at the consequences of those assumptions, and the entire plane geometry unfolds in front of us. So we are going to take a similar approach today. Question is, what assumptions are we going to start with? And in this case, the answer is that I am going to use the definition, in a sense, the definition of Brahman in Taittiriya Upanishad 2.1, which describes Brahman in a way as Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam, Brahman. Beautiful sentence. Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam, Brahman. Brahman is Satyam, existence itself. Jnanam, consciousness itself. And Anantam, infinite. Three words, Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam. If we understand these three words, we made some progress in terms of at least having a bit of understanding of what Brahman is. And that is what Taittiriya Upanishad says. That Brahman is Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam. Okay, so let us begin. Let us begin with Anantam. Anantam, Ananta. Anta it means end. Ananta means without limit, no end, limitless, infinite. Right? That is Ananta, meaning that Brahman is infinite. Now it turns out that in Sanskrit, there were two words used for infinity. One is Ananta and the other is Asankhya. Asankhya. Sankhya is numbers. Asankhya is limitless in numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, infinity. That is Asankhya. Right? Asankhya meaning innumerable. It's what we would now call countable infinity. Right? You can count 1, 2, 3, 4 up and so on. That is countable infinity. Ananta, on the other hand, is uncountable infinity. What does uncountable infinity mean? It means that if you think of a number like pi, right? Pi, it is 3.1416, etc., 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 a set of numbers going on till infinitely without coming to any kind of an end. That number is included in the definition of Ananta. So, two kinds of infinities: countable infinity, that is Asankhya, and uncountable infinity, that is Ananta. Now it turns out that Ananta is a bigger infinity than Asankhya. Not all infinities are equal. Now, we didn't know this until about a little over 100 years ago. It was George Cantor who proved some of these theorems. And it's interesting. I don't want to put too much weight on this, but it is interesting that Hindu philosophers correctly use the word Ananta rather than Asankhya in describing Brahman. So, one thing is that Brahman is, as the Upanishad says, Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam. What does Anantam mean? Infinity. And obviously, Brahman would have to be the largest possible infinity. And perhaps we could call Brahman Ananta Ananta, infinitely infinite. Right? Okay. Now, Brahman is infinite, granted, but infinite in terms of what? Right? Is it infinite in oranges, bananas? It is infinite in terms of what? Infinite in terms of three things. One is that Brahman is infinite in space. Right? Brahman is infinite in space, infinite in time, and infinite in objects. So Brahman is infinite in terms of in three ways. Right? Let's take them one by one and try to see what it means. So infinite in space means it is infinite in all possible dimensions. Today we think of space as three-dimensional, and if we stick with it, Brahman is infinite in three dimensions, meaning that it is everywhere, right? It is infinite and it is everywhere. See, infinite does not usually necessarily mean everywhere. and everywhere does not necessarily mean infinite. So Brahman is both. It is infinite and everywhere. So what is the picture in front of us? Is Brahman like air around us? No, because of two reasons. One, air is not infinite and air is not everywhere. There are molecules of different gases in the air. They are separated by a certain distance, etc., etc. When we say Brahman is everywhere, we mean it. It is inside an atom and in interstellar space. It is literally everywhere, right? Is it like space? Coming closer, possibly. Space may or may not be infinite, but it is everywhere, right? So at least so we thought, until Einstein came along and said, well, space can be bent. If something could be bent, it is necessarily not everywhere. Okay. So Brahman is something little bit different than the space of this universe, right? Now, if Brahman is everywhere, what are the implications? Is infinite and everywhere, what are the implications? One implication is that this universe is in Brahman. Brahman is in this universe, yes. Brahman is everywhere in this universe. But the universe itself is within Brahman. Okay, that's one implication. Another implication is, can this Nirguna Brahman, which is what we are talking about, can this Nirguna Brahman show up one day at your front door? The answer is that Brahman doesn't have to do that. He is already there, right? He is already there at your front door. He's already there inside your house, and so on. So that is another implication of this. Can Brahman move? The answer is no. Why? Because he doesn't have to move. He has occupied all possible positions. So there is no need for Brahman to move. Right? In Bhagavad Gita, for example, Krishna says something to the effect, weapons cannot cut it. You might remember. What does that mean? Weapons cannot cut it. Does it mean that Brahman is so strong, maybe made out of some sort of a strong steel or something, that there is no way you can hacksaw it? No, that is not what it means. Anything that is everywhere leaves you no room to cut. You need room to be able to cut something into two pieces, right? So the implication of infinite in space and everywhere, these are some of the implications of infinite in space. What about infinite in time? Infinite in time means eternal, right? It means eternal, unborn. Brahman was not born. Right? Anything that is born dies. Brahman will not die. This universe, according to science, is said to have started about 13.8 billion years ago. Time itself, as we know time itself began with the beginning of the universe. What is the implication of all of this? The implication is that time as we know it is within Brahman. It is not that Brahman is within time. It is that time as we know time is within Brahman. Okay. So that is what it means when we say that Brahman is infinite in time. Now, so Brahman is infinite in three things: infinite in space, infinite in time, and now infinite in objects. One of my very favorite speakers on YouTube is Swami Sarvapriyananda. I just thoroughly enjoy whatever it is that he has to say. And he has spoken on this particular topic. And here is something I learned from him when I listened to what he had to say. Infinite in objects. What does that mean? That means that Brahman is in every possible object. Now, if objects are physical objects, right? Car, trees, people, houses. If objects are physical objects, then it is obvious that if Brahman is infinite in space, he is obviously going to be infinite in objects. All possible objects are within space somewhere, physical objects. And so he is going to, all the objects are going to be included. And we need not talk about Brahman being infinite in objects separately. It would have been a consequence of Brahman being infinite in space. So when Sarvapriyananda says that Brahman is infinite in objects, that it is asankhya because objects are discrete, then there must be objects that do not occupy space. I'm not entirely sure what those are, but that must be the case for infinite in objects as being the third requirement for Brahman. Now, so far we have talked about Ananta. Ananta means infinite, the largest possible infinity. It means everywhere. It means infinite in space, time, and objects. Right? That is Brahman. Now, what are the implications of this? One implication is that Brahman is right here where I'm sitting right now. Since he is everywhere, he's right here. Since he is there all the time, he is here right now. And since he is inside every object, he is inside me. So Brahman is inside me right here, right now. Is there more of Brahman in an elephant than a person? I think the answer is yes. Since elephant occupies a much bigger volume, there is more of, and Brahman is uniformly there throughout space. There is more of Brahman in an elephant than in a human being. What about a donkey? Perhaps there is about equal amount of Brahman in a donkey as in a human being. I have a dog. His name is Rocky. He is a 7-pound Shih Tzu. There is less of Brahman in my dog. What is the implication? To me, the implication is that amount of Brahman does not matter for practical purposes. If you have more Brahman in you, doesn't mean that you are any better than anybody else. Right? The amount is irrelevant for practical purposes. How could this be? So consider, for example, lemonade. Right? If the objective you have in drinking lemonade is to satisfy your thirst, then amount matters. Right? You might have to drink a glass of lemonade and not an ounce of lemonade. But if the purpose is to figure out the taste of lemonade, amount is irrelevant. Even a small amount gives you an idea of what the taste of lemonade is. So amount matters in some cases, it does not matter in other cases. In that sense, as far as Brahman is concerned, amount does not matter. Now, this Brahman that is within me, I call it my Atman. So with my usual ego, I say, this is my Atman. You call the Brahman inside of you as your Atman, and so forth. Now, if I were to come to Minneapolis and sit where you are sitting currently, what would that mean? That would mean that I am now occupying an Atman that you occupied before. Remember, Brahman cannot move. Brahman is basically fixed. We are moving through Brahman. We are moving through Brahman. And if I end up occupying your position, I have essentially occupied, my Brahman is the same as the Brahman you used to have. And what this means to me is that our Atma, our Atmans are interchangeable. We are all connected in that particular sense. So from my perspective, these are some implications that follow almost immediately based upon the fact, based upon the assumption, once again, the assumption that Brahman is infinite, right? Brahman is infinite. Anantam. So Brahman is three things according to the Upanishad. Brahman is Satyam, Jnanam, and Anantam. We talked about Anantam so far. Ananta so far. Let's talk about Satya, Satyam, or what is often called Sat. What is Sat? Sat is ultimate truth, ultimate reality. What is ultimate? We need to define all these terms. What is ultimate reality? Reality is everything around us is real, right? This laptop is real, the lamp is real, the house is real, etc., etc. But all these things are temporarily real, temporary existence. Ultimate reality is that which exists eternally, right? Exists forever. None of these things that I just mentioned is ultimate reality. It is temporary reality. It is not ultimate reality, right? It is not ultimate existence. Also, these objects are not infinite in space. So they are not infinite in time, they are not infinite in space. Brahman needs to be infinite in both. So these objects that we are familiar with, including the earth and the sun and the universe, are not Brahman because they don't meet the criteria set forth, namely that Brahman has to be infinite in time and infinite in space. So the objects are not Brahman. And if they are not Brahman, they are not the ultimate reality. So as we look at these objects, what is common to all of them? The Hindu philosophers say that what is common to all of these objects that are temporary in this way, what is common to all of them is existence itself. Very complicated idea, because it is not possible, at least I don't know, how to understand existence itself. It is all objects exist, but they are not permanent. What is permanent about them, what exists forever, is existence itself. That is Ananda, that is Brahman, that is Sat. Sat is existence itself. It is inconceivable. It only can be conceived in the form of an object. So it is existence that makes objects appear, right? Just as water appears as waves, similarly, existence appears as objects. That is the thinking pattern. And that existence is Brahman. That existence is the ultimate reality. Is there anything in our physical world that comes close to this concept? Maybe one would have to think more about it. The thing that comes to mind is the so-called God particle, the Higgs boson, right? Higgs boson is that particle that gives mass to all other particles, such as elementary particles, such as electrons and protons and so on. So Higgs boson is not mass, but it gives mass to other fundamental particles. Just like existence is not an object, but gives existence to objects, right? If that analogy makes any sense. So that is Sat. What does Sat mean again? Ultimate reality, existence. Okay, existence itself. So Brahman is infinite, and Brahman is existence itself. So we started with 3 words: Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam. We've talked about Anantam. We just talked about Satyam or Sat. Let's now talk about Jnanam. Jnanam means knowledge, and more often written as Chit, consciousness, because it is consciousness that makes knowledge possible. So what is this Chit or consciousness? It's another difficult subject. Nobody really knows what consciousness is, but we all know that we are conscious human beings. We may have difficulty defining what all that means. But let us think of it this way. Life is a series of experiences. All of these experiences are fleeting experiences. They don't last forever. So they are not Brahman. The experience itself is not Brahman. Common to all of these experiences is consciousness. Because if you don't have consciousness, you would not have any experience. It is this consciousness that is always there, everywhere, all the time. That consciousness is Anantam. That consciousness is Brahman. So, the three words that we started with, Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam, we defined Anantam as infinite in space, time, and objects. We defined Satyam as the ultimate reality, right? Ultimate existence, existence itself. And Jnanam as consciousness itself. So Brahman is existence itself, consciousness itself, and infinite. So while Brahman is achintya, starting with these three words, we may have made some progress toward trying to understand what this Brahman might be. Now, this consciousness, we all know that we are aware of things. We have awareness. Is this consciousness or chit the same as awareness? The answer is not exactly. The awareness that we have, we are aware of sort of in three ways. We are aware of our external surroundings. We are aware of our internal body and bodily functions. And we are aware that we are aware. We are aware of our own awareness. Right? What is this awareness? As I see it, this awareness is, I would call, conditioned consciousness. In other words, it is chit or consciousness conditioned by our body, mind, and intellect. So let me give you an example. We said earlier that Brahman is like the gas in the car. Now, you could use that gas in a lawnmower. That gas has now become conditioned by the capabilities of that lawnmower. The same gas perhaps could be used in a Ferrari. And in that case, is conditioned by the capabilities of that car. Or perhaps it could be used in let's assume, in an airplane, in which case it is conditioned by the capabilities of the airplane. So what we call awareness is not Brahman, is not pure consciousness. It is consciousness conditioned by our BMI, by our body, mind, and intellect. This awareness has been a subject more recently of considerable amount of scientific research in neuroscience and other places. And there is a problem called the hard problem of consciousness because nobody has figured out what consciousness really is. So this is something that is currently being investigated in the scientific field. A couple of last things. One is that you have heard, we all have heard, Brahman being referred to as Sat Chit Anand. This Upanishad that we started with called it Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam. Right? Satyam is Sat, Jnanam is Chit, Anantam is not. Anantam is and Ananda are two things, different things. Right? What is this Anand? Anand is bliss. Bliss meaning permanently happy. So if we call Brahman Satyam, Jnanam, if you call Brahman Sat Chit Anand, right? Sat Chit Anand. What does that mean? Are we saying that Brahman is happy? We are calling him Sat Chit Anand. How can a Nirgun Brahman, a Brahman who has no attributes whatsoever, how can that Brahman be called happy? So what does this Ananda mean? My way of looking at it is the following. If we think of ourselves and say, when are we happy? We are happy when our desires for various objects are satisfied. Right? We are happy, temporarily happy when we get something that we want. Now, unfortunately, we want many, many different things, and we don't get some of them, we get some of them, and we are not 100% happy as a result of not getting some of the things that we are looking for. What Hindu philosophy is saying is this. Hindu philosophy is saying that we as human beings are ignorant people. We don't really know who we really are. We think of ourselves as our body, or as our mind, or as our intellect, or perhaps even at the level of vasanas. But that is not what we really are, right? We are not our body, mind, and intellect. We are Atman, which is essentially the same as Brahman. So if we truly are Brahman, and if all objects are in Brahman, Brahman is in all objects, then it means that if we only understood that we are Brahman, we would have all the objects of our desire, because they are all within Brahman. In that sense, the word bliss is being used. It is not, this is my opinion, it is not that Brahman is in a state of bliss. I'm talking about Nirgun Brahman. But it is that Brahman can give us bliss. And that, I think, is what we mean by Sat Chit Anand. It should have been called Sat Chit Ananta. Right? Existence, consciousness, infinite, as the Upanishad says. But he is often called Satchidanand, perhaps to remind us that if we want to be happy, we need to get close to Brahman. Let me stop here. And if anybody has any comments, please go ahead.
First of all, thank you for making a presentation. It was well done. I think this is a subject which is difficult to understand. Only way you can is experience it, understand it yourself. And that's for that reason, I'm glad you're following Sarvapriyananda, who makes it as clear as he can, but you still need a living teacher. And when you're discussing all these, if as you're in the process of understanding and learning, you need to bounce off those ideas as you are gradually advancing with a person who's alive and he's understood the subject matter himself or herself. So in my experience, having experience communicated with my teacher, I was able to understand the subject matter very clearly. But again, it has a continuing process of making sure that you are on the topic. I think you described it very well, but this is a subject which cannot be described. The subject which has to be experienced, felt, realized, and lived. Because Satya that we're talking about, Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam, Satya is not an adjective in this case. Satya is a noun in this particular situation. Because the qualities of all these entities, as you described with Ananta being space, time, objects which are unlimited, Satya is nirvikaram. That means it is changeless. It is all-pervading sarvagatam. It is always there, is eternal, nityam. It cannot be divided into pieces, akhandam. And it is one of a kind, advitiyam, and it is propertyless, nirgunam. That means property is really like a screen on which the movie is projected. So it looks as if it has got properties, but understanding is that it is the moving movie that we are seeing and that we are attributing the qualities. So if you, or if any person can understand the subject matter for himself or herself, that is good. Then you are at peace with yourself. But it is virtually impossible to explain in words what Brahman is. It has to be felt, experienced, and lived. I'll stop at this stage because there's so many other bright people who can comment.
Well, I kind of agree with what you are saying. As I said to begin with, that Brahman is achintya, cannot be understood by talking about and thinking about Brahman. It has always been very interesting to me that having realized all this, the Upanishads and also the various teachers have never stopped talking about him. Isn't that interesting that we have talked about Brahman for ages, telling everybody that you can't really learn it that way. So if that is the case, then we should quit talking about Brahman and start doing something else, whatever that is, to understand what Brahman really is. But many of us, including me, are not exactly made that way. We are people who like to think about any subject that is out there. And so here it is in terms of thinking about this. And while I didn't go through, in view of time, go through the other things that you mentioned, words such as ekam, omnipresent, nirakar, nitya, nirvikar, aksharam, chiranjeevi, nirmal, jnanam, omniscient, omnipotent, etc., etc. All of these words that are being used for Brahman, they follow directly from Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam. In other words, you don't need to make any additional assumptions to show that Brahman is also all of these words that I just mentioned. So from a logic standpoint, it was interesting to me personally that one could begin with a few ideas that are there in this Upanishad and then try to explain or at least give people some idea of what this Brahman might be, realizing full well that one could never, really fully understand the subject. So that's where I was.
I think you are right. I'm sorry, break in for a moment. Is there's a important verse to remember. Acharyat padamadatte. The teacher teaches 1/4 of the knowledge. 1/4 comes from swamedaya, from your own reflection, analysis, using different resources, scriptures. 1/4 comes sabrahmacharibhya, by the friend circle that you maintain, discuss, interact, and learn from them. And the padam, by the rest of the life, living through the life. So knowledge is only complete after you have been initiated and taught by a teacher who has gone through the traditional teaching. You study on it, you try to inculcate it with your own hard work, discuss with the people with similar interests, if they are, some of them are experienced even better, and live through your life and complete your education. And it has to be experienced and lived. It cannot be described in word. The reason why the teacher continues to teach is because he or she wants to share the beauty that he or she has experienced in life. So if like we have enjoyed our life, and what we like to do to our children is to pass on the same kind of pleasures that we have. The same thing applies to your friend circle that you want to pass on. And some teachers decide to conclude their life by taking the samadhi, like Jnaneshwar did after having completed work by the age of 21. So everyone has to decide for himself or herself what course that individual to take. No one method is right or one method. Thanks again for discussion. Thank you.
Thank
you, Anand. Prasanna, you're very good. I'm very happy that you have brought your mathematical thinking and logical thinking to these very abstract subject. And it's much easier for me to relate to these abstract concepts by the principle that you laid out. And in terms of not being able to explain, it's like love. When I say I love somebody, what does love mean? If you think of a person who cannot speak, who's a mute, and he's having a peda in his mouth, and then he cannot tell you what that peda tastes like. His face, you can see the expression on his face that it is something that is very sweet. So when I say Brahman has to be experienced, in that sense, I have to really experience love before I can tell what love is. And I agree with you that for a topic that cannot be understood, cannot be explained, cannot be defined, cannot be confined, for people talking about that for thousands of years, it's still a puzzle to me. The conversation should have ended long time ago, but it hasn't, which leads me to believe that even now, people don't have an understanding of what Brahman is. Not a full understanding, maybe partial understanding, 90% understanding, but not full understanding. But we're all trying. We're all trying to understand that concept. But the idea of Brahman being infinite in space, in time, and in objects appeals to me. That's a very nice way of putting it. Thank you.
I think after having gone through this, I knew before I started that there was no way of understanding Brahman by sitting in a chair and thinking. That was well known. But the process of going through this, to me, was educational. Okay, to me was educational, Because, for example, when I thought of Sat Chit Anand, and what Ananda actually means, and why do we call Brahman Sat Chit Anand? I came up at the end of all of this to a different conclusion than where I was before. So I am not going to say that thinking about Brahman is a bad thing. Yeah, it's not true. By thinking about Brahman deeply, one could understand Brahman to some degree, maybe 1%. Okay. So it is a useful exercise, but one has to know, obviously, that this is not going to take you all the way.
I have a question for Dr. Sane and Dr. Kumar, that you said it has to be understood. Brahman has to be understood. Even if one were to have some experience, peaceful or blissful, one would never know if that experience, what it was. So we would never know what is understanding Brahman, isn't it? And that's why it is said Brahman is something that cannot be explained. Does that make sense?
I think you have to discuss with a person who is alive and experienced it before. For example, when you go outside and are mesmerized with beautiful flowers in the desert that we see these days around, and come to realize that your energy or that life inside you is similar to the life of those smiling flowers all around you, and you see the oneness in them, and you find a complete happiness and peace in that company of those beautiful flowers. That is an experience where you're seeing the face of God, you're experiencing it yourself. So that experience, you have to feel it yourself. And when that happens on fairly consistent basis, you are at peace. The thing is to realize what the beauty of this universe is, and not get bothered with the challenges that are thrown at you, knowing fully that all the challenges that we face are transient at best. So what you have to see is just like that screen of the movie I mentioned, is always remains stable and allows the changing pictures to move around. So that's the kind of mental makeup one has to have, and enjoy the beauty that God has given to us, recognizing that you yourself is none different than that movie screens. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not, but I'm trying to explain to you as much as I can.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, this is Madhavi. It was a very good talk and a very different perspective coming from you. I'm sorry I missed your last lecture, the recent one, but I hope there will be a recording if it hasn't been done yet, sent to us. One thing, I was amused how oftentimes Brahman is referred with the pronoun he.
Yes.
So that is the bias of our intelligence. The other comment I would like to make is it is a bit ironic that we try to intellectualize everything, this concept. It's a very difficult concept. All this discussion definitely helps clarify some of the doubts and whatever we may have imagined before. But ultimately, I find personally that you reach a point where you actually have to give up the intelligence, set aside your thinking and intelligence to really experience, if there is any such thing, that's the irony I find, that you employ your intelligence up to this point, thinking and logical and everything, whatever avenue you can think, intuition, but in the end you just have to set that aside to feel that existence or whatever words you're using for it.
I personally totally agree with you. Take it as far as you can intellectually, as we always, and we do that, at least I do that, because that is the training that we have. That is how we have dealt with practical subjects. And we apply the same sort of tools in a way and see how far we can go. And in this case, we know that we can't go all the way using those tools, as you just said. So something, but go as far as you can to begin with. You don't have to be totally ignorant. And then try to use other means for understanding Brahman. The other use I see of this sort of thing, is as a preamble to Bhagavad Gita. You know, when we go through Bhagavad Gita, one stanza at a time, it takes forever, for one thing. And secondly, if you have some basic knowledge of these concepts to begin with, I feel that one would be able to understand some of these other finer texts perhaps a bit faster.
So definitely, I mean, without the study, it's difficult, but and I totally agree that you have to take as far as possible that we possibly can the study. And but that study ultimately also you have to renounce, in some sort of way.
That means give up your ego.
Yeah.
Anyway, name is Bharat Parekh. I came from a family which used to have lots of yogis and sadhus and enlightened beings visiting us. But I was a young kid in a public school, learning all about science and so on. Wanted to be an astronaut, and so quite contrary to the life I experienced growing up. And so I always wondered, and I had lots of discussions with some of these yogis as to what is it they do. I mean, they're just sitting around. I used to tell them, look, you're just sitting around and everybody comes and, bows at you and you don't say anything. You just kind of smile and just have a presence, so to speak. So they would then they enjoyed this sort of type of conversations, which they never got from all the adults who treated them with such respect. So we went through a number of exercises. They'll get me to make my voice, say Om, and other types of things, to identify elements that you can cultivate and develop and so on. Anyway, to me as a kid, it just seemed like jumbo mumbo. Okay, I really didn't pay much attention. I was more interested in the physics and technology and all that. So I come to US, and I'm a student, and then I was in the midst of the psychedelic revolution that had just begun with, LSD and peyote and so on. And seemed to me a lot of the things that I learned in that discussion was very similar to some of the descriptions that some of these yogis had given me as to what it felt like to be in samadhi, because I knew one of those people for the whole day disappeared and was totally in dhyan. And we had invited him for lunch and there was no show. And no show for the evening. And we learned that he was just totally gone in his own state. So I decided to seriously experience what it is like to have this peyote experience. I was with people who were, at that time, peyote was legal for members of the Native American church. And so with them, I was able to be part of it, a ceremony, and then experience that. And believe me, that was one time where I felt I had seen what might be called Brahman. That was the first time that I realized how everything, all objects and light and sounds, and they all pervade everywhere. My sense of identity was lost in that entire experience. And it lasted for several hours, and it continued to be there until the point I said, oh, that's what they were talking about. As soon as I said that, I came down to earth. So in a way, I felt that my mind, my intelligent, intellectual self actually annulled me from continually living in that experience. And to that extent, I think what Madhavi was saying makes some sense to me. For whatever it is, I just wanted to share this with you. And only other point I want to make is, Anand, much as I, being a physicist, I appreciate some of the mathematical linkages, particularly the God particle and so on, aspects of it. But the thing that I do want to bring out is that it's probably not fair to call Brahman with the adjective he. Maybe you want to make it just to be sensitive to the gender. I don't know if you're aware of, in your discussion, you always talked about he. So this is just
I was actually half kidding, I mean, I'm not so particular about he or she. We use these pronouns just for convenience, but just to bear in mind, it is just for sake of usage. I mean, you can use the pronoun it if you want, but I was just kidding. I was not very.
anyway.
Well, that's good. I think many of us, people like me, for example, are used to saying things, some of these things that perhaps we should be much more careful about. So you have to use something, he, she, it.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure if
Maybe you can just say that Brahma. That's
yeah,
it.
or you can
That
continually say Brahman without
That's
using
right.
any of
Yeah.
these other pronouns.
That would.
So,
Mr. Parekh, I have a question for you. Sometimes if we are able to communicate with you, I would love to understand or learn from you what the yogis described as in that state, how they felt, what they felt. I would love to learn that. You said you had conversation with the yogis as to.
Oh, you're asking me a question?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't. Can
like
you?
Sometimes I would like to, or we would like to learn from you what you learned from the yogis as to what their experiences were like when they would go in samadhi, because that always has been a curiosity for me as to what people feel.
Well,
when they are in
I
samadhi.
think that, again, I was a, 8-9-year-old kid
Okay.
when I had these conversations. So I have a sense of it, but maybe my memory is faulty, and it's probably multiplied by all the readings and everything I have done of some of these things. So with that, I'll just like to say that one of the things that came clearly to me was this idea of breaking down separation of our own selves with all and everything. In other words, there just isn't the kind of separation that we feel. Like, I'm here in my body and my consciousness, and I see the television or the computer and your faces and so on. That differentiation that I experience disappears. That was one of the points that they talked about. And so as such, I think one of them said, well, you just disappear. You're just not there. So that's a kind of,
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't have any
No,
depth.
that's good. Thank you.
It just that I was a young kid, you know,
Yeah.
so they
Okay.
talked to me like I was a, what do you tell a kid?
Okay. Thanks.
Only thing I would like to make a comment about Bharat's comment. He was describing about these yogis coming and everybody bowing down to them and they're not saying much. But you have to remember that's called darshan. When you come to see the people who are enlightened or knowledgeable, they're emitting positive energy outside. So it's not the words that they say, but what the positive energy they emit. It is something that you don't realize it. Like if you go to a rose garden, or garden which is fragrant with flowers, even if you don't pick up a flower and walk away with it, that beautiful bouquet walks away with you. So when you're in the company of the people who are enlightened and you spend time with them, depending on the amount of time you spend, how much amount of positive energy you communicate with, this is a two-way street. Darshan is you taking the darshan of the individual, and that individual giving you darshan. It's a two-way street. So the person who's enlightened is always giving you positive energy out. How much you absorb depends upon your connection with that individual. And that's what recharges you without you realizing it.